Hi, welcome to our next segment. In this video, we're going to be looking at pop art. This is in relation to all the 20th century movements that we've been talking about. I know it's a little overwhelming and there are quite a few, but it is what it is. And as we move more into contemporary art, the styles really shift pretty quickly, and as you will find too, especially when we get more into contemporary art time period, there really isn't like a specific style or movement that defines art. So anyway, so in terms of thinking about contemporary art, because I think, especially when we looked at abstract expressionism, we certainly are getting into new territory. Also looking, with surrealism, Merritt Oppenheim's, for a cup, we're seeing artists, experimenting with subject matter, experimenting with new materials to make art. And so it can be a little overwhelming and maybe confusing, and sometimes we look at some of this art and think, well, I just don't get it. And it's ironic that a lot of people say they don't get contemporary art. Because unlike Egyptian tomb paintings or Greek sculpture, art made since 1960 reflects our own recent past. It speaks to the dramatic social, political, and technological changes of the last 50 years, and it questions many of society's values and assumptions. A tendency of postmodernism. We looked at this concept when we looked at architecture just a little bit, but we haven't really delved, into it in terms of the visual arts. A concept sometimes used to describe contemporary art. What makes today's art especially challenging is that, like the world around us, it has become more diverse and cannot be easily defined through a list of visual characteristics, artistic themes, or cultural concerns. Minimalism and pop art, two major art movements of the early 1960s, offer clues to the different directions of art in the late 20th and 21st century. Both rejected established expectations about art's aesthetic qualities and need for originality. Minimalist objects are spare, geometric forms often made from industrial processes and materials which lack surface detail, expressive markings, and any discernible meaning. Pop art, which we're going to look at more in detail in this segment, took its subject matter from low-brow sources like comic books and advertising. Like minimalism, its uses of commercial techniques eliminate emotional content implied by the artist's individual approach. Sometimes that has been important to the previous generation of modern painters. This result was that both movements effectively blurred the line distinguishing fine art from ordinary aspects of life and forced us to reconsider art's place and purpose in the world. So pop art, popular culture, popular art. At first glance, pop art might seem to glorify popular culture by elevating things like soup cans, Andy Warhol soup cans, comic strips. We'll see Klaus Oldenburg's fluffy sculptures or soft sculptures, like these big these big soft sculptures he did of food, hamburgers and fries and cakes, to the status of fine art on the walls of museums. But then again, a second look may suggest a critique of the mass marketing practices and consumer culture that has emerged in the United States after World War II. So we're going to be focusing on the work of Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol's Gold Marilyn Monroe that you see over to the left from 1962 clearly reflects the inherent irony of pop. The central image on a gold background evokes a religious tradition of painted icons, transforming the Hollywood starlet into a Byzantine Madonna that reflects our obsession with celebrity. Notably, Warhol's spiritual reference was especially poignant given Monroe's suicide a few months earlier. Like religious fanatics, the actress's fans worshipped their idol, yet Warhol, sloppy silkscreen, recalls attention to the artifice of Marilyn's glamorous facade and places her alongside other mass-marketed commodities like a can of soup or a box of Brillo pads. And so what you're looking at on the right is the famous soup cans that he painted. So it's important for us to think about how pop art started and the genesis of it. In this slide, it's not surprising that the term pop art first emerged in Great Britain, which suffered great economic hardship after the war. In the late 1940s, artists of the independent group first began to appropriate idealized images of the American lifestyle they found in popular magazines as part of their critique of British society. Critic Lawrence Alloway and artist Richard Hamilton are usually credited with coining the term, possibly in the context of Hamilton's famous collage from 1956, Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing, made to announce the independent group's 1956 exhibition. This Is Tomorrow in London. The image prominently features a muscular, semi-nude man holding a phallically positioned Tootsie Pop. So there you get the name Pop. Pop art's origins, however, can be traced back even further. In 1917, Marcel Duchamp asserted that any object, including his notorious example of a urinal, we looked at this fountain, could be art as long as the artist intended it as such. Artists of the 1950s built on this notion to challenge boundaries distinguishing art from real life, and discipline of music and dance as well as visual art. Robert Rauschenberg, whose work that you're looking at on my right, his desire to work in the gap between art and life, for example, led him to incorporate such objects as bedpillows, tires, and even a stuffed goat in his combined paintings. I haven't had time to talk about his work, and I feel bad about that. He's an incredible artist, but anyway, this is one of his most famous sort of composition paintings called Bed. And, you know, his paintings really merged features of painting and sculpture. So we really see the medium of painting really changing, where it's really not, it's more of an afterthought in a lot of ways, where artists are sort of using paint to sort of as a texture. And so some of these other experimental forms become more of the composition. Likewise, Klaus Oldenburg, who we'll be looking at later, created an installation called The Store in a vacant storefront where he sold crudely fashioned sculptures of brand name consumer goods. These proto-pop artists were in part reacting against the rigid critical structure and lofty philosophy surrounding abstract expressionism, the dominant art movement at the time, which we just covered. But their work also reflected the numerous social changes taking place around them. The years following World War II saw enormous growth in the American economy, which, combined with innovation in technology and media, spawned consumer culture with more leisure time and expandable income than ever before. The manufacturing industry that had expanded during the war now began to mass produce everything from hairspray and washing machines to shiny new convertibles, which advertisers claim all would bring ultimate joy to their owners. Significantly, the development of television, as well as changes in print advertising, placed new emphasis on graphic images and recognizable brand logos, something that we now take for granted in our visually saturated world. It was in this artistic and cultural context that pop artists developed their distinctive style of the early 1960s, characterized by clearly rendered images of popular subject matter. It seemed to assault the standards of modern painting, which had embraced abstraction as a reflection of universal truths and individual expression. And so what you're looking at here is a 1950s advertisement for the American Gas Association. In contrast to dripping paint and slashing brushstrokes of abstract expressionism, and even of proto-pop art, pop artists applied their paint to imitate the look of industrial printing techniques. This ironic approach is exemplified by Lichtenstein's methodically painted Binder dots, a mechanical process used to print pulp comics. And so he did a series of these images, and here's sort of a close-up where you can sort of see how they do look like sort of like a printed comic book. As the decade progressed, artists shifted away from painting towards the use of industrial techniques. Warhol began making silkscreens before removing himself further from the process by having others do the actual printing in his studio. And as you know, his studio is called The Factory, and it was sort of this, it was really like a place where a lot of people hung out. And there's a fantastic movie called The Factory, or The Factory Girl, that has, I can't think of her name, that blonde actress. It's really good. I would recommend it. Similarly, Oldenburg abandoned his early installation and performances to produce large-scale sculptures of cake slices, lipsticks, clothing pins that he's best known for today, and we will be looking at his work as well. So this is the work of Andy Warhol that is featured in the AP College Board 250 works. It's a diptych, and remember, a diptych is like two panels sort of hinged together. We learned about that when we learned about altarpieces, particularly in the Northern Renaissance unit that we covered a long time ago. So it's a diptych made of two silver canvases on which the artist silkscreened a photograph of Marilyn Monroe 50 times. At first glance, the work, which explicitly references a form of Christian painting, and this is what I'm going to show you and talk a little bit further about. Here's a diptych with Virgin and Child enthroned and the crucifixion. So this is sort of what I was referring to earlier. In its title, it invites us to worship the legendary icon. So in a sense, he's taking this sort of celebrity, Marilyn Monroe, and sort of creating, or sort of comparing her to a religious icon like Madonna, whose image Warhol plucked from popular culture and immortalized as art. But as in all of Warhol's early paintings, this image is also a carefully crafted critique of both modern art and contemporary life. So, with sustained looking, Warhol's work reveals that he was influenced not only by pop culture, but also by art history, and especially by the art that was popular in New York. For example, in this painting, we can identify the hallmarks of abstract expressionism, painters like Jackson Pollock and William de Kooning. As in the work of these older artists, the monumental scale of Marilyn's diptych, because it is more than 6 feet, it's 6 feet by 9 feet, demands our attention and announces the importance of the subject matter. So remember, abstract expressionists usually painted on very large-scale canvases. Furthermore, the seemingly careless handling of the paint and its overall composition, the even distribution of form and color across the entire canvas, such that the viewer's eye wanders without focusing on one spot, are each hallmarks of abstract expressionism, as exemplified by Jackson Pollock's drip paintings. Yet Warhol references these painters only to undermine the supposed expressiveness of their gestures. Like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, who we, again, briefly covered. We didn't actually cover Jasper Johns. Again, I'm sorry about that. Whose work he admired. He uses photographic imagery, the silkscreen process and repetition to make art that is not about his interior life, but rather about the culture in which he lived. Warhol takes as the subject of his painting an impersonal image. Though he was an award-winning illustrator, instead of making his own drawing of Monroe, he appropriated an image that already existed. And that basically means he used an image. Appropriation is a term that we'll definitely talk about when we look at more contemporary art. And furthermore, appropriation is using an image that is not your own. I forgot to mention that part. That's pretty a pretty important aspect. So here you have Andy Warhol using an image, and it's not even an image of another artist's drawing, but a photograph that had been made for mass reproduction. So true to form, the actress looks at us seductively from under her heavy-lidded eyes with parted lips, but her expression is also a bit inscrutable, and the repetition remakes her face into an eerie, inanimate mask. Warhol's use of the silkscreen technique further flattens the star's face. By screening broad planes of unmodulated color, the artist removes the gradual shading that creates a sense of three-dimensional volume and suspends the actress in an abstract void. Through these choices, Warhol transforms the literal flatness of the paper, thin publicity photo, into an emotional flatness, and the actress into a kind of automation. In this way, this painting suggests that Marilyn Monroe, a manufactured star, was a made-up name with a made-up name is merely a one-dimensional sex symbol, perhaps not the most appropriate object of our almost religious devotion. All right. While Warhol's silkscreen repetitions flatten Monroe's identity, they also complicate his own identity as the artist of this work. The silkscreen process allowed Warhol, or his assistants, to reproduce the same image over and over again using multiple colors. Once the screens are manufactured and the colors are chosen, the artist simply spreads ink evenly over the screen using a wide squeegee. Though there are differences from one face to the next, these appear to be the accidental byproduct of a quasi-mechanical process, rather than the product of the artist's judgment. Warhol's rote painting technique is echoed by the rigid composition of the work, a 5x5 grid of faces repeated across the two halves of its surface. Here, as in many neo-Dada, minimalist, and conceptualist work, the grid is like a program that the artist uses to automate the process of composing the work instead of relying on subjective thought or feeling to make decisions. In other words, Warhol's cool, detached composition is the opposite of the intimate, soulful encounter with the canvas associated with abstract expressionism. But whereas most works that use grids are abstract, here the grid repeats a photo of a movie star, causing the painting to resemble a photographer's contact sheet or a series of film strips placed side by side. These references to mechanical forms of reproduction further prove that for Warhol, painting is no longer an elevated medium distinct from popular culture. Also, in a lot of ways, when I look at something like this, I really feel that photography, especially in Warhol's case, because he really was considered a painter. He wasn't really considered a photographer. That photography, in a lot of ways, has sort of replaced painting, and that the actual painting is more of a residue and sort of an afterthought. Aside from radically changing our notion of painting, Warhol's choices create symmetry between the artist and his subject, who each seems to be less than fully human. The artist becomes a machine, just as the actress becomes a mask or a shell. Another word we could use to describe the presence of both the artist and the actress might be ghostly, and in fact, Warhol started making his series of Marilyn paintings only after the star had died of an apparent suicide, and eventually collected them
with other disturbing paintings under the title Death in America. Her death haunts this painting. On the left, her purple, garishly made-up face resembles an embalmed corpse. Let me get back. While the lighter tones of some of the faces on the right make it seem like she is disappearing before our eyes. Warhol once noted that through repeated exposure to an image, we become desensitized to it. In this case, by repeating Monroe's mask-like face, he not only drains away her life, but also ours as well, by deadening our emotional responses to her death. Then again, by making her face so strange and unfamiliar, he might also be trying to resensitize us to her image, so that we remember her not just as a symbol, but a person whom we might feel pity. From the perspective of a psychoanalytic theory, he may even be forcing us to relive and therefore work through the traumatic shock of her death. The painting, then, is more than a celebration of Monroe's iconic status. It is an invitation to consider the consequences of the increasing role of mass media images in our everyday lives. So our next pop artist that we're going to be looking at is Klaus Oldenburg. I mentioned him earlier. He's an American sculptor, and he's really best known for his public art installations, typically featuring very large-scale replicas of everyday objects. Another theme in his work, which I happen to love, are these soft sculpture versions of everyday life. Many of his works were made in collaboration with his wife as well. And so as you can see, there's a lot of variety. There's the hamburger I was talking about earlier, musical instruments. Since 1962, Oldenburg has been making these soft sculptures based on common objects ranging from household fixtures, such as toilets, fans, and light switches, to foodstuffs. His later soft sculptures are sewn from vinyl or canvas and are stuffed with filler material to achieve varying degrees of flaccidity, his method of modeling. I think this one over here is one of his sort of later sculptures. These soft forms, which possess many identities, exist in a state of constant permutation, shifting in response to movements or the forces of gravity, and creating visual paradoxes as something that might seem hard shifts into something soft. Oldenburg has explained, "I like to work in a material that is organic seeming and full of surprise, inventive all by itself. The contours of his soft sculptures have erotic overtones as well, and droop, suggesting the vulnerability, inanimate forms of the human body." Examples, and there's tons of examples of these soft sculptures that you can find on the internet. So we're going to be looking at some other work of Oldenburg. This is the work that the College Board has chosen to represent him. It's one of these sort of everyday objects, in this case a lipstick, that has been a sculpture that's very larger than life, very large scale. It's called Lipstick Ascending on Caterpillar Tracks. So I'm going to go back to this photo. So a monumental tube of lipstick sprouting from a military vehicle appeared uninvited on the campus of Yale University amidst the 1969 student protests against the Vietnam War. While the sculpture may have seemed like a playful, if elaborate, artistic joke, Klaus Oldenburg's lipstick ascending on caterpillar tracks was also deeply critical. Oldenburg made the 24-foot high sculpture in collaboration with architecture students at his alma mater, and then delivered it to Yale's Benedict Plaza. In the plaza, the sculpture overlooked both the office of Yale's president and a prominent World War I memorial. Lipstick ascending on caterpillar tracks claimed a visible space for the anti-war movement, while also poking fun at the solemnness of the plaza. The sculpture served as a stage and backdrop for several subsequent student protests. Oldenburg and the architecture students never intended for the original lipstick ascending on caterpillar track sculpture to be permanent. They made the base of plywood, and the red vinyl tip of the lipstick could be comically inflated and deflated, although the balloon mechanism didn't always work. The original remained in Bionic, I think that's how you say it, Plaza for 10 months before Oldenburg removed it in order to remake the form in metal. The resulting sculpture was placed in a less prominent spot on Yale's campus, where it remains today. So Oldenburg had experimented with lipstick forms earlier in the 1960s. He pasted catalog images of lipsticks onto postcards of London Piccadilly Circus. This is an example. The resulting collages showed lipstick tubes looming like massive pillars over Piccadilly's plaza. I think these are kind of funny. In the Yale sculpture, the artist combined the highly feminine product with the masculine machinery of war. In doing so, he playfully critiqued both the hawkish, hyper-masculine rhetoric of the military and the blatant consumerism of the United States. In addition to its feminine associations, the large lipstick tube is phallic and bullet-like, making the benign beauty product seem masculine or even violent. The juxtaposition implied that the United States' obsession with beauty and consumption both fueled and distracted from the ongoing violence in Vietnam. Here's another one of his sculptures. It's a giant clothespin. Oldenburg had been designing large-scale vinyl versions of household objects since his one of his exhibitions in 1962 called the Green Gallery Exhibition. He had created collages and drawings that played with the notion of massive domestic objects in public places, but lipstick was his first large-scale public work. Oldenburg went on to make several other public sculptures that enlarged everyday domestic items to monumental dimensions. For example, he rendered a clothespin on the scale of an ancient Egyptian obelisk in a 1976 sculpture for Philadelphia. By bringing both domestic and military objects into public space, lipstick ascending caterpillar tracks blurred the lines between public and private, between the war in Vietnam and the culture of the United States. In doing so, it upheld Oldenburg's 1961 declaration that I am for an art that is political, erotic, mystical, that does something other than sit on its ass in a museum. I am for an art that imitates the human, that is comic, is necessary, or violent, or whatever is necessary. Okay, so I am going to stop here. So this concludes our segment on pop art. If you liked any of these artists, I do certainly encourage you to do your own research. Again, we are very limited on time. Our next segment is going to be dealing with performance art and happenings, so stay tuned.